Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the moment the runner reaches out isn't the moment you think it is? Not a sign that everything is fixed. Not a guarantee that union is here. Not even proof that they've changed. So why does it feel so powerful? Why does one message, one small interaction suddenly shift everything inside you? And here's the real question. What if the runner reaching out is not about them coming back, but about testing whether you are still the same person they left? Because the truth is this. The message is not the meaning. Your state is. Chapter 1. The illusion of their back, why a message is not a reunion. There is a moment in this journey that can feel almost electric. A notification appears. A name you haven't seen in a while. A simple message. And suddenly everything inside you shifts. Your heart reacts. Your thoughts speed up. Your attention moves instantly toward them. For a brief moment, it feels like everything you've been waiting for has finally arrived. They're back. That thought comes quickly. Almost automatically. Because the mind is searching for meaning. It wants to connect the moment to an outcome, to turn a simple action into a larger story. And the story it tells is this. This is the beginning of reunion. This is proof that everything has changed. This is the moment where the distance finally ends. But this is where one of the biggest misunderstandings exists. Because the message is not the meaning. The action is not the outcome. And the runner reaching out does not mean what you think it means. At least, not in the way your mind immediately interprets it. To understand this, you have to slow everything down. You have to look beyond the surface. Beyond the words. Beyond the moment itself. Because what you are reacting to is not just the message. It is what you believe the message represents. Hope. Validation. Movement. A shift in the connection. And those beliefs create a very strong internal response. But that response is not always based on reality. It is based on expectation. Earlier in the journey, you may have associated their presence with progress. If they were there, things were moving. If they were gone, things were stuck. So when they reach out, it feels like movement again. Like something is finally happening. But the truth is more subtle than that. Because their message is not a conclusion. It is a moment. A single point within a much larger process. And that moment, by itself, does not define what comes next. It only reflects what is happening now. And what is happening now is not always what you think. Because the runner reaching out is not necessarily a sign of readiness. It is not necessarily a sign of clarity. It is not necessarily a sign that they have changed in the way you imagine. It is simply a reflection of energy, a response to a shift that has already occurred. But that shift is not in them. It is in you. This is where everything begins to change. Because earlier in the journey, your energy may have been reaching, focused on them, thinking about them, trying to understand the connection, trying to move it forward. And that reaching created pressure, even if it was subtle, even if it was not expressed outwardly. It was there. Because energy is not hidden. It influences the connection. It shapes the dynamic. And that pressure created distance. Because when something is being pursued, there is something to move away from. But then something shifted. Not because you forced it. Not because you decided to let go. But because the need itself began to dissolve. You were no longer thinking in the same way. No longer reacting in the same way. No longer waiting for something to happen. And because of that, your energy changed. It returned to you. It became grounded, stable, at rest. And when your energy is at rest, there is no pressure, no expectation, no sense that something must happen. And without that, there is nothing to resist, nothing to run from, nothing creating distance. And this is where the runner begins to feel the shift. Not consciously. Not as a decision. but as a response, because the connection no longer feels the same. It no longer carries the same intensity, the same pressure, the same energy that created distance. It feels different, lighter, more open, and that openness allows movement. It creates the possibility for contact, for interaction, for a message. But that message is not the destination. It is the reflection of the shift that has already happened. And this is where the illusion becomes clear. Because the mind wants to take that moment and turn it into something more, something bigger, something final. But the truth is, it is not yet complete. It is not yet defined. It is simply an opening, an opportunity, a point where the dynamic can either continue or change completely. And what determines that is not the message. It is your state. Because if you respond from the same place as before, the same patterns return, the same reactions, the same expectations, the same energy, and the dynamic repeats. But if your state has truly changed, if you are grounded, if you are no longer reaching, if you are no longer attaching meaning to every moment, then everything is different. Because you are not responding from the past. You are responding from the present. And the present does not carry the same patterns. It does not recreate the same dynamic. It allows something new to emerge. And this is why the message is not the meaning. Because the meaning is not in what they did. It is in how you are. Because your state determines everything that follows. Not their action. Not their words. Not the fact that they reached out. But who you are in that moment. So if you find yourself experiencing that moment, a message, a sudden return of contact, pause. Before you attach meaning to it. Before you let your mind create a story. Before you assume that everything has changed. Ask yourself something deeper. Am I still the same person I was before? Because that is the only question that matters. Not what they are doing, but who you are being. Because if you are still reacting the same way, then nothing has changed. But if you are different, if your state is different, if your energy is no longer reaching, then everything has already changed. And the message is simply reflecting that, not creating it. So the next time the runner reaches out, do not see it as a conclusion. Do not see it as the answer. See it as a mirror, a reflection of where you are. Because the moment itself is not what matters. What matters is what you bring into it. Because that is what determines everything that follows. Not the message, but your state. And that is the truth behind the illusion. They are not back. They are responding. And what they respond to next depends on you. Chapter 2. Why the runner reaches out. It's not what your mind assumes. When the runner reaches out, the first instinct is to interpret it, to give it meaning, to connect it to something larger, to turn a simple action into a story. They miss me. They finally understand. They're ready now. And these thoughts feel natural. Because the mind is always trying to make sense of what it sees. It looks for patterns. It looks for causes. It tries to create a clear explanation. But the problem is this. The explanation you create is often based on expectation, not reality. Because when you want something to happen, your mind fills in the gaps. It takes a small action and expands it into something bigger. Something more certain. Something that feels like progress. But the truth behind why the runner reaches out is not as simple as your mind wants it to be. Because it is not just about them. It is about energy. And energy does not move in straight lines. It does not follow logic. It does not always reflect intention. It responds to state. And when your state changes, their behavior can change too. Not because they decided to change, but because the dynamic has shifted. Earlier in the journey, your energy may have been intense, focused on them, trying to understand the connection, trying to make something happen. And that focus created pressure. Even if it was subtle, even if it was not expressed outwardly. It was there, because attention carries energy. And when your attention is directed outward, it creates movement. It creates a sense that something is being pursued. And when something is being pursued, there is something to move away from. This is why the runner created distance. Not because they didn't care, but because the energy within the connection felt overwhelming. It felt like something they needed to step back from. But then something changes. Not in them. In you. You stop focusing in the same way. You stop trying to understand everything. You stop waiting for something to happen. And because of that, your energy shifts. It becomes quieter, more grounded, more stable. You are no longer reaching, no longer projecting expectation, no longer creating the same pressure. And this is where the shift begins. Because when your energy is no longer pushing outward, the dynamic changes. There is no longer something to resist, no longer something to run from, only space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. The runner can feel the difference. Not consciously, not in a way they can explain, but energetically. Because the connection no longer feels the same. It no longer carries the same intensity, the same pressure, the same expectation. It feels lighter, more open. And that openness creates curiosity. A pull. Not a strong, overwhelming pull, but a subtle one. The kind that makes them think about you. The kind that makes them wonder. The kind that leads to a simple action. Reaching out. And this is where the misunderstanding happens. Because when they reach out, it feels significant. It feels like a decision. Like a moment of clarity. Like something changed in them. But in reality, it is a response. Not a conclusion. Not a final step. But a reaction to the shift in energy. Because when the pressure is gone, there is nothing preventing movement. Nothing creating distance. Nothing keeping them away. So they move closer. Not because they have everything figured out. Not because they are suddenly ready. But because the environment has changed. And that environment is created by your state. This is why their message can feel confusing. Because it does not always match the meaning you give it. They may reach out casually. Without depth. Without explanation. Without the clarity you expected. And that can feel disappointing. Because the mind was expecting more. Something clear. Something definitive. But the message is not meant to be definitive. It is meant to reflect where the energy is now. And that energy is no longer blocked. It is open. Flowing. Free to move. But movement does not always mean completion. It simply means possibility. And this is where your awareness becomes important. Because the meaning of the message is not in what they say. It is in how you respond. If you respond from the same place as before. From excitement. From attachment. From the need to understand what this means. Then the old dynamic can return. Because the same energy is being reintroduced. The same patterns. The same movement. But if your state has truly changed. If you are grounded. If you are present. If you are not attaching meaning to every word. Then everything is different. Because you are no longer reacting. You are simply experiencing. And that changes the entire outcome. Because the connection is no longer being shaped by expectation. It is being allowed to unfold. Naturally. Without pressure. Without force. And this is what the runner is responding to. Not your words. Not your actions. But your state. Because your state determines everything. Not what they do. Not why they reached out. But what happens next. So when the runner reaches out, do not rush to define it. Do not assume it means something specific. Do not let your mind create a story. Instead, pause and observe. Not them, but yourself. How do you feel? Are you calm? Grounded? Present? Or are you being pulled back into old patterns? Because that answer tells you everything. Not about them, but about you. And your state is what determines what this moment becomes. Not the message, not their intention, but how you meet it. Because the truth is this: the runner reaches out, not because everything is resolved, but because the energy has shifted. And what happens next depends entirely on whether that shift remains or disappears. And that is what this moment really means. Not that they came back, but that something changed. And now, you have the opportunity to meet it differently. Chapter 3. The energetic trigger behind the message: why they reach out when you stop reaching. There is a moment in this journey that feels almost paradoxical. You stop focusing on them, and suddenly they reach out. You stop thinking about the connection constantly, and something shifts. You stop trying to understand everything, and movement begins. And the first reaction is confusion. Why now? Why didn't this happen when you were trying so hard? Why didn't they reach out when you were thinking about them every day? Why does it happen when you finally feel calm, when you are no longer waiting? It feels backwards. It feels like something doesn't make sense. Because the mind expects effort to create results. It expects that if you focus more, something will happen. If you care more, something will change. If you try harder, the connection will move forward. But the connection does not respond to effort. It responds to energy. And energy moves in a very different way than the mind expects. To understand why the runner reaches out when you stop reaching, you have to understand how energy was moving before. Earlier in the journey, your attention was directed outward. You were thinking about them, trying to understand what they felt, trying to interpret every moment, trying to move the connection forward. And even if you were not doing anything externally, internally, there was constant movement. Your energy was not at rest. It was reaching, leaning towards something outside of you, trying to close a gap, trying to create an outcome. And that movement created pressure. Not visible pressure. Not something you could point to, but something that was felt. Because energy is not contained. It influences the dynamic. It shapes how the connection is experienced. And when energy is reaching, it creates imbalance. Because one side is moving toward, and the other is responding to that movement. Not consciously, not intentionally, but instinctively. Because when something feels like it is being pulled, the natural response is to move away, to create space, to regain balance. This is why the runner created distance. Not because they did not feel the connection, but because the energy within it was not stable. It carried intensity, expectation, a sense that something needed to happen, and that made it difficult to stay. So they stepped back, not as a decision, but as a response. And as long as that energy existed, the dynamic remained. No matter what you did, no matter how much time passed, no matter how much you tried to understand it, because the underlying state did not change. But then something shifts. Not because you found a solution, not because you finally figured everything out, but because the need itself begins to dissolve. You stop focusing in the same way. You stop trying to interpret every detail. You stop waiting for something to happen. And because of that, your energy changes. It returns back to you. It becomes grounded, stable, at rest. And when your energy is at rest, there is no pressure, no expectation, no sense that something must happen. And without that, there is nothing to resist, nothing to move away from, nothing creating distance. And this is where the trigger happens. Not because you did something, but because you stopped doing what was creating the imbalance. The moment your energy stops reaching, the connection becomes open, free from pressure, free from expectation, free from the subtle force that was pushing it away. And in that openness, the runner feels the difference. Not as a thought, not as a realization, but as a feeling. Because the connection no longer feels overwhelming. It no longer feels like something they need to escape. It feels safe, neutral, balanced. And that feeling creates curiosity. A subtle pull. Not intense. Not overwhelming. But enough to create movement. Enough to make them think about you. Enough to make them reach out. And this is why the timing feels so specific. Because it is not based on time. It is based on state. It happens when your state changes. Not when enough time has passed. Not when they decide to come back. But when the energy becomes aligned. And this is why it often feels like it happens out of nowhere. Because you were no longer expecting it. You were no longer waiting. You were no longer focused on it. You were simply living. And in that state, the connection is no longer being controlled. It is being allowed. And allowing creates flow. Because there is nothing blocking it. Nothing interfering. Nothing creating resistance. So the energy moves. Naturally. And that movement appears as contact. As a message. As a moment that feels like something is beginning. But that moment is not the cause. It is the result. The result of a shift that has already happened within you. And this is why trying to recreate it through effort never works. Because effort reintroduces pressure. It brings back the sense that something needs to happen. That something is missing. And that returns the energy to imbalance. But when you are not trying, when you are not reaching, when you are simply present, there is no interference. And that is what allows everything to move. So if you find yourself in that place, where you are no longer focused on the connection, where you feel calm, grounded, at peace with what is, and suddenly they reach out, do not be surprised. Do not think it is random. Recognize what is actually happening. You have shifted. Your energy has changed. And that change has opened the space. For movement. For connection. For something new to begin. Not because you made it happen, but because you finally allowed it. And that is the truth behind the message. Not that they suddenly changed, but that you did. And in that change, everything else follows. Naturally. Effortlessly. Without needing you to make it happen. Because the moment you stop reaching is the moment everything can finally come to you. And that is why they reach out. Not because you pulled them, but because there is nothing left pushing them away. Chapter 4. The hidden test you don't realize what their message is actually checking. There is a part of this journey that most people never see clearly. Not because it is hidden on purpose, but because it does not look like what they expect. When the runner reaches out, it feels like an answer. A response to everything that came before. A sign that something has changed. A moment that carries meaning. And because of that, the mind immediately reacts. What does this mean? Are they coming back? Is this the beginning of something real? But beneath that reaction, there is something deeper happening. Something that is not obvious. Something that is not about the message itself. It is about what the message is revealing. Because the moment they reach out is not just an action. It is a test. Not a conscious test. Not something they are deliberately doing. But an energetic one. A moment where the connection is checking something. Not in them. In you. Think about how the dynamic existed before. There was movement. One person reached. The other stepped back. One tried to understand. The other created space. And that pattern repeated. Not because either of you chose it, but because of the energy within the connection. Your energy may have been focused outward. Trying to connect. Trying to make sense of everything. Trying to move the connection forward. And that created pressure. Subtle. Unspoken. But real. And that pressure created the need for distance. Not because they didn't care, but because the energy was not stable. So they moved away. And the dynamic continued. Until something changed. Not externally, but internally. You stopped reaching. Not because you decided to, but because the need dissolved. You were no longer focused in the same way. No longer trying to understand everything. No longer waiting for something to happen. And because of that, your energy shifted. It became grounded, stable, at rest. And when your energy is at rest, the dynamic changes. There is no longer pressure, no longer expectation, no longer something to run from. And this is what creates the opening, the space where the runner can reach out. But this moment is not just about contact. It is about contrast. Because when they reach out, they are not just reconnecting. They are encountering a different version of the connection. And that is where the test exists. Not in what they say, but in how the energy responds. Because the connection is no longer what it was. It is not driven by the same patterns. Not shaped by the same reactions. Not influenced by the same imbalance. It is different. And this difference creates a moment of truth. A moment where the old dynamic either returns or disappears completely. And what determines that is not them. It is you. Because when they reach out, the connection is checking something. Is the energy still the same? Is there still pressure? Is there still movement that creates imbalance? And your response answers that. Not your words. Not your actions. But your state. If you react the same way as before. If you feel pulled, excited, anxious. If your mind starts trying to interpret what this means, then the old dynamic reactivates. Because the same energy is present. The same reaching. The same movement. The same pressure. And the connection returns to what it was. But if your state has truly changed, if you are grounded, calm, present, if you are not attaching meaning to the message, not trying to define what this moment is, then everything is different. Because the energy is stable. There is no pressure, no expectation, no sense that something must happen. And in that state, the old dynamic cannot return. Because the conditions that created it no longer exist. And this is why the message is a test. Not to see what you will do, but to reveal who you are now. Because your response reflects your state. And your state determines the direction of the connection. Not the message. Not their intention. But how you meet it. This is why so many people feel like they are back at the beginning. Because when the runner reaches out, they return to the same patterns. The same reactions. The same expectations. And that recreates the dynamic. Not because the connection failed, but because the energy did not change. But when the energy has changed, when your state is different, the moment becomes something else entirely. Not a restart, but a continuation. A continuation of alignment. A movement that is no longer influenced by the past. And this is what makes this moment so important. Because it is not just about contact. It is about confirmation. Confirmation of whether the shift within you is real. Or whether the old patterns are still active. So if you find yourself in that moment, where they reach out, pause. Not to analyze. Not to interpret. But to observe. Yourself. How do you feel? Are you calm? Grounded? Present? Or are you being pulled into the same reactions? Because that answer tells you everything. Not about them, but about you. And your state is what determines what this moment becomes. Not the message, not the words, but the energy you bring into it. Because the connection is not asking, what will they say next? It is asking, has the dynamic changed? And your presence answers that. Not through effort, not through control, but through being. And if you are no longer the same, then everything else cannot remain the same. And that is the truth behind the test. Not that they reached out, but that you now have the opportunity to meet the moment differently. And that difference is what changes everything. Chapter 5. Your old reaction versus your new state, the difference that changes the outcome. There is a moment in this journey that reveals everything. Not through what they do, not through what they say, but through how you respond. When the runner reaches out, it does not just bring contact. It brings contrast, a clear reflection of who you were before and who you are now. And that contrast is what determines everything. Because earlier in the journey, your response felt automatic. You did not have to think about it. The reaction was immediate. A message appeared and your attention shifted instantly. Your heart reacted. Your thoughts accelerated. Your emotions followed. There was excitement, relief, curiosity, but also something else. Tension. Because beneath the excitement, there was a need to understand what this meant, a need to interpret their words, a need to know what would happen next. And that need created movement. Your mind started asking questions. What do they want? Is this the beginning of something? Should I respond now or wait? What does this mean for the connection? And those questions were not neutral. They carried emotion. They carried expectation. They carried the belief that something important was happening, that something needed to be understood, that something needed to be managed. And that created pressure, not outwardly, but internally, because your energy was no longer at rest. It was moving, trying to find answers, trying to create clarity, trying to control what was happening. And that movement reactivated the dynamic, because the energy returned to what it was before. Reaching, seeking, trying to make something happen. And that created the same conditions, the same imbalance, the same pattern, even if the situation looked different. But now something has changed. The same moment happens. A message appears. A name you recognize. A connection reopens. But your response is not the same. You notice it immediately. Or sometimes you don't notice it at all. Because it feels so natural. So calm. So simple. There is no rush. No urgency. No need to react immediately. You see the message. And you remain where you are. Present. Grounded. Aware. And this is where everything changes. Because your state is no longer reactive. You are not being pulled into the moment. You are observing it. And that observation creates space. Space between what happens and how you respond. And in that space, there is no pressure, no expectation, no sense that something must happen. You are not trying to interpret the message. You are not trying to define what it means. You are simply aware of it. And that awareness is what creates stability. Because your energy is not moving. It is not reaching. It is not trying to close a gap. It is at rest. And when your energy is at rest, there is no imbalance, no pressure, no dynamic being recreated. And this is the difference. Not in what they did, but in how you are. Because earlier, your reaction was part of the dynamic. It contributed to the movement. It reinforced the pattern. But now, there is no reaction, no movement, no pattern, only presence. And presence changes everything. Because presence does not create tension. It does not create expectation. It does not create something that needs to be resolved. It simply allows the moment to exist, without needing to turn it into something else. And this is what makes your new state so powerful. Because you are no longer responding from the past, from old patterns, from old emotions. You are responding from the present, from awareness, from a place where nothing needs to happen. And that changes the entire outcome. Because the connection is no longer being shaped by reaction. It is being shaped by stillness. And stillness allows alignment. Not through effort. Not through control. But through the absence of interference. And this is what most people do not realize. They think the message is what changes everything. But the message is just the moment. What changes everything is your state within that moment. Because your state determines the energy. And the energy determines the dynamic. So if your state is still reactive, if you are still being pulled, If you are still trying to understand what this means, then the old dynamic continues, even if the situation looks different. But if your state is stable, if you are grounded, if you are present, then the dynamic cannot return, because the conditions that created it no longer exist. And this is why your response matters. Not in what you say, but in how you are. Because your words are not what define the moment. Your energy is. And your energy is no longer the same. It is not reaching, not seeking, not trying to make something happen. It is simply present. And presence is what allows everything to change. So if you find yourself in that moment, where they reach out, where something begins to shift, do not focus on what they are doing. Focus on yourself. Notice your state. Are you calm? Grounded? At ease? Or are you being pulled back into old patterns? Because that answer tells you everything. Not about them, but about you. And who you are in that moment is what determines what happens next. Not the message, not the timing, not their intention, but your state. Because your state is the only thing that has truly changed. And that change is what changes everything else. Not because you forced it, but because you are no longer the same person. You are no longer reacting. You are no longer chasing. You are no longer trying to create an outcome. You are simply present. And from that place, everything unfolds differently, naturally, effortlessly, without needing you to make it happen. Because you are no longer part of the pattern. You are beyond it. And that is the difference. Not in what they did, but in who you have become. Chapter 6. Why most people restart the cycle. Here, the subtle mistake that recreates the dynamic. There is a moment in this journey that feels like progress. A message appears. Contact resumes. Something begins to move again. And for a brief moment, it feels like everything is finally changing. Like the distance is closing. Like the connection is coming back. Like the journey is moving towards something real. But this is also the moment where many people unknowingly return to the beginning. Not because something went wrong, but because something was not yet fully understood. This is the point where the cycle either ends or starts again. And the difference is not in what happens externally. It is in how you respond internally. Earlier in the journey, your experience was shaped by reaction. You were not just observing the connection. You were inside it, responding to every shift, every message, every silence. And that reaction created movement. Your thoughts would race. Your emotions would follow. Your attention would move outward, trying to understand, trying to interpret, trying to make sense of what was happening. And that movement created energy. Energy that was not stable. Energy that was reaching. Energy that carried expectation. Because beneath every reaction, there was a belief that something needed to happen, that something was missing, that this moment had to lead somewhere. And that belief created pressure, even if it was subtle, even if it was not expressed outwardly. It was there. And that pressure shaped the dynamic. Because pressure creates resistance. And resistance creates distance. This is why the cycle existed. Not because of what you did, but because of how you were. Because your state was not at rest. It was seeking, trying to move the connection forward. But now something has changed. You have gone through the shift. You are no longer thinking the same way. No longer reacting the same way. No longer needing the connection to define your experience. You are more grounded, more present, more stable. And because of that, the energy has changed. The pressure is gone. The dynamic has softened. And this is what creates the opening. The moment where the runner reaches out. But this is also where the test appears. Because even though your state has changed, the old patterns are still familiar, still accessible, still easy to return to. And when the message appears, it activates something. Not in the same way as before. but enough to create a subtle pull, a temptation to go back, to interpret, to analyze, to assign meaning. And this is where most people restart the cycle. Not because they made a conscious decision, but because they slipped back into the old state. They see the message and immediately begin to think, what does this mean? Is this the beginning of something? What should I do next? And those questions create movement. They shift your attention outward. They reintroduce expectation. They bring back the sense that something needs to happen. And in that moment, the energy changes again. It is no longer at rest. It is reaching. And that reaching recreates the same condition, the same pressure, the same imbalance. And the dynamic begins again. Even if the situation looks different. Even if the interaction feels new. Because the underlying energy is the same. And energy is what determines everything. This is why the cycle repeats. Not because the connection failed, but because the state returned to what it was before. Because the moment was not met with presence. It was met with reaction. And reaction reactivates the past. But when you remain in your new state, everything is different. You see the message, and nothing pulls you. You are aware, present, grounded. You do not rush to respond. You do not feel the need to understand. You do not attach meaning to what is happening. You simply experience it. And that experience is stable. Because your energy is not moving. It is not trying to create something. It is not trying to control the outcome. It is at rest. And when your energy is at rest, there is no pressure, no expectation, no imbalance. And without those things, the cycle cannot restart. Because the cycle requires movement. It requires reaction. It requires the sense that something needs to happen. But when none of those things are present, the dynamic dissolves completely, and something new emerges. Not a repetition of the past, but a continuation of alignment. A connection that is no longer shaped by patterns, but experienced through presence. And this is the difference. Not in what they do, but in how you are. Because the moment itself is neutral. It does not determine the outcome. It only reflects the state you bring into it. So when the runner reaches out, it is not the moment that matters. It is how you meet it. If you meet it with reaction, the past returns. If you meet it with presence, something new begins. And this is why this stage is so important. Because it reveals whether the shift within you is complete. Not in theory, not in understanding, but in experience. In real time. In the moment where the old pattern could return. But does not. Because you are no longer the same. So if you find yourself in that moment, pause. Not to analyze. Not to interpret. But to stay where you are. Present. Grounded. At ease. Because that is what keeps the cycle from returning. Not effort. Not control. But the absence of reaction. Because the moment you stop reacting is the moment the past no longer has a place. And from that place, everything becomes possible. Not because you made it happen, but because you did not return to what it was. You remained in what you have become. And that is what changes everything. Not the message. Not the timing. But your state. Because your state is the only thing that determines whether the cycle continues or ends. Chapter 7. The truth, the message is not the shift you are. There is a moment in this journey where everything becomes clear in a way that feels almost unsettling. Not because it is difficult to understand, but because it removes the illusion you have been holding on to. For so long, it may have felt like the shift would be visible, that something external would change, that there would be a moment you could point to and say, this is it. This is when everything became different. And often, that moment is imagined as contact. A message. A conversation. Something that proves the connection is moving forward. But when you look deeper, you begin to see something else. The message is not the shift. You are. And this realization changes everything. Because it shifts your focus completely. Away from what is happening externally. And back to what is happening within you. Think about how your experience used to be. You were focused on the connection. Trying to understand it. Trying to define it. Trying to move it toward something. And because of that, your state was not stable. It depended on what was happening outside of you. If there was contact, you felt close. If there was distance, you felt disconnected. If something was unclear, you felt unsettled. Your experience was tied to external events. And those events became your reference point. You looked at them to understand where you were. To determine what the connection meant. To decide what would happen next. But this created a very specific pattern. Because your state was always shifting. Always reacting. Always adjusting based on something outside of you. And that made the connection feel unstable. Not because it was. But because your experience of it was. But now something has changed. You are no longer using external events as your reference point. You are no longer looking at what they do. To understand what is happening. You are looking at yourself. Your state. Your presence. And that changes everything. Because your state is no longer dependent on the connection. It is independent. Stable. Grounded within you. You can experience the connection. Without needing it to define how you feel. Without needing it to give you clarity. Without needing it to move in a specific way. And that independence is what creates alignment. Because alignment is not about what happens externally. It is about how you exist internally. And you are no longer existing in the same way. You are not reacting. Not seeking. Not trying to control the outcome. You are simply present. And presence is what removes distortion. It allows you to see things clearly. Without adding meaning. Without projecting expectation. Without trying to turn a moment into something more. And this is where the truth becomes visible. Because when the runner reaches out, you see it differently. You do not see it as proof. You do not see it as a solution. You do not see it as the beginning of something specific. You see it as what it is. A moment. Nothing more. Nothing less. And that perspective changes everything. Because you are no longer attaching your experience to the moment. You are not allowing it to define how you feel. You are not using it as a reference point for what will happen next. You are simply aware of it. And that awareness keeps you stable. Because your state does not shift with the moment. It remains constant. And this is what makes the connection different now. Not the message. Not the interaction. But you. Because you are no longer the same person who was waiting for that moment. You are no longer the same person who needed it to mean something. You are not looking for answers in what they do. You are not trying to interpret every detail. You are simply present. And presence is what allows the connection to be real. Not because something has been confirmed, but because nothing needs to be. And this is why the message is not the shift. Because the shift happened before the message. Within you. In the way you think. The way you feel. The way you experience the connection. You are no longer creating the same patterns. No longer reinforcing the same dynamic. No longer contributing to the same imbalance. You are aligned. And alignment is what creates movement. Not the message. Because the message is only a reflection. A reflection of the state you are in. A response to the energy you carry. And if your energy is stable, then what follows will be stable. But if your energy is reactive, then the same patterns will return. And this is why understanding this truth is so important. Because it removes the focus from them. From what they do. From what they say. And brings it back to you. To your state. Your presence. Your awareness. Because that is the only thing that truly matters. Not the moment. But who you are within it. So if you find yourself experiencing contact, a message, a shift in the connection, do not rush to define it. Do not assume it means something specific. Instead, ask yourself something simple. Am I still the same? Am I reacting? Am I seeking? Am I trying to create something from this moment? Or am I present, grounded, at ease with what is? Because that answer tells you everything. Not about them, but about you. And your state is what determines everything that follows. Not the message, not the timing, not their intention, but who you are. Because the moment you truly change, the connection has no choice but to reflect that. Not immediately, not always in a way you expect, but inevitably, because it is not separate from you. It mirrors your state, and your state has changed. So the message is not the shift. It is the reflection of it. And once you see that, you stop waiting for moments to define your journey. You stop looking for signs. You stop trying to interpret what everything means. Because you already know. Not through thought, but through being. And from that place, everything becomes simple. Not because the journey was easy, but because you are no longer looking for something outside of you. You are already aligned. And that is what changes everything. Not the message, but you. Chapter 8. What it means if you stay grounded the moment the dynamic finally ends. There is a moment in this journey that does not look like an ending. It does not feel like closure. It does not feel like something has been resolved. It does not feel like a clear conclusion. And yet it is the moment the entire dynamic comes to an end. Not because something external stops, but because something internal no longer continues. This is the moment you stay grounded. Not as an action, not as something you force, but as a state, a natural way of being. A quiet presence that does not react, does not reach, does not try to control what happens. And this is where everything changes. Because earlier in the journey, your experience was shaped by movement. Your thoughts moved toward them. Your emotions followed. Your attention was directed outward. Trying to understand, trying to connect, trying to resolve something that felt incomplete. And that movement created the dynamic. One side reached. The other responded. One side moved forward. The other created distance. And that pattern continued. Not because it was chosen, but because the energy within it was not stable. It was not at rest. It was seeking, trying to create something, trying to close a gap. And that created pressure. Even if it was subtle, even if it was not expressed. It was there. And that pressure is what the runner responded to. Not consciously, but instinctively. Because when something feels like it is being pulled, the natural response is to move away, to create space, to regain balance. But now something is different. The same moment appears. A message, a shift, a point where the connection could move again. And instead of reacting, you remain still. You do not rush to respond. You do not feel the need to interpret what it means. You do not attach your emotions to what is happening. You simply observe. And that observation is not passive. It is powerful. Because it means your energy is not moving. It is not reaching. It is not trying to create an outcome. It is grounded, centered, at rest. And when your energy is at rest, there is no pressure, no expectation, no imbalance. And without those things, the dynamic cannot continue. Because the dynamic requires movement. It requires reaction. It requires the sense that something needs to happen. But when none of those things are present, there is nothing to sustain it, nothing to recreate it, nothing to bring it back. And this is where the ending happens. Not externally, but internally. Because the pattern no longer exists within you. You are no longer participating in it. Not because you chose to stop, but because you have outgrown it. Your state is different. Your awareness is deeper. Your presence is stronger. And that changes everything. Because the connection is no longer being shaped by old patterns. It is no longer influenced by expectation. It is no longer defined by movement. It is allowed to exist without needing to become something, without needing to be controlled, without needing to follow a specific path. And this is what creates true alignment. Not action, not effort, but stillness. Because stillness removes interference. It removes the subtle energy that was keeping the dynamic in place. It creates space. And in that space, everything can shift. Not because you made it happen, but because there is nothing stopping it. This is why staying grounded is not just important. It is everything. Because it is the point where the past can no longer return. The patterns have no place. The reactions have no foundation. The dynamic has no energy to continue. And without energy, it disappears. Completely. And this is what most people miss. They think the ending will feel obvious. That they will know when the cycle is over. That there will be a clear moment of closure. But the truth is, it feels quiet, subtle, almost ordinary. Because nothing dramatic happens. Nothing needs to. Because the change is not in what happens. It is in how you experience it. You are no longer reacting. No longer chasing. No longer trying to make sense of everything. You are simply here. And that presence is what ends everything that came before. Not through force. Not through decision. But through the absence of what once sustained it. And from that place, something new becomes possible. Not a continuation of the old dynamic, but a completely different experience. A connection that is no longer based on movement, but on stability. No longer driven by reaction, but by presence. No longer defined by roles, but by alignment. And this is where everything becomes real. Because you are no longer looking for something to happen. You are not waiting, not seeking, not trying to reach a moment. You are already there, fully present, fully grounded. And that state is what allows everything else to align. Not because you created it, but because you are no longer preventing it. So if you find yourself in that place, where you feel calm, where you are not reacting, where you are simply observing what happens, do not underestimate it. Do not think that nothing is happening. Recognize what is actually happening. The dynamic has ended. Not externally, but within you. And that is the only place it ever needed to end. Because once it ends within you, it cannot exist anywhere else. And from that place, everything becomes possible. Not through effort, not through control, but through being. And that is what it means to stay grounded. Not something you do, but something you are. And that is what changes everything. Chapter 9. What happens next when you don't chase? Everything reveals itself. There is a question that quietly appears after everything begins to shift. Not in a loud or urgent way. Not with anxiety or confusion. But in a calm, almost distant way. What happens now? Because the dynamic is no longer the same. You are no longer reacting. No longer chasing. No longer trying to make something happen. The connection feels different. Quieter. More stable. Less intense in the way it used to be. And in that stillness, the mind begins to wonder, if I'm not chasing anymore, what comes next? This is where another layer of understanding begins. Because for so long, the journey felt like movement. Like something that needed to progress. Something that needed to go somewhere. From separation to reunion. From confusion to clarity. From distance to closeness. There was always a direction. A sense that you were moving toward something. But now that sense is gone. Not because the connection has ended, but because the need for it to move has disappeared. And that changes how everything unfolds. Because what happens next is not created by effort. It is revealed by stillness. Earlier in the journey, your actions were driven by need. You were trying to understand, trying to fix, trying to move things forward. And that created movement. But it also created interference. because your energy was not at rest. It was influencing the connection, shaping it, trying to direct it, and that interference prevented natural alignment. But now, there is no interference. You are not trying to control anything, not trying to define what happens next, not trying to reach a specific outcome. You are simply present, and presence creates space. Space where things can unfold naturally, without pressure, without expectation, without force. And in that space, everything reveals itself. Not immediately, not in a dramatic way, but gradually, clearly. Because when there is no interference, there is no distortion. You are no longer interpreting everything through emotion. You are no longer attaching meaning to every shift. You are seeing things as they are. And that clarity changes everything. Because you are no longer asking, what does this mean? You are simply observing what is happening. And that observation allows truth to become visible. Not through thought, but through experience. You begin to notice things differently. Not what you expected. Not what you imagined. But what is real. You see how the connection moves. How it responds. How it aligns. Without needing to push it in any direction. And this is where the real shift happens. Because you are no longer part of the movement. You are not creating it. Not influencing it. You are allowing it. And allowing creates flow. Because there is nothing stopping it. Nothing blocking it. Nothing trying to change it. And flow reveals truth. Because when something is allowed to move naturally, it shows what it actually is. Not what you want it to be. Not what you fear it might be. But what it truly is. And this is where the answer to what happens next becomes clear. Not through prediction. Not through expectation. But through experience. Because what happens next is not something you create. It is something you witness. The connection either deepens, or it does not. It either aligns, or it moves in a different direction. But whatever it does, you are no longer attached to it. You are no longer defining your experience based on the outcome. And that is what makes this stage so powerful. Because your peace is no longer dependent on what happens next. It exists now, independent of the connection, independent of the outcome. And that independence changes everything. Because you are no longer trying to hold on to something. You are not trying to make it become something specific. You are allowing it to be what it is. And that is what allows real alignment. Because alignment cannot be forced. It cannot be created through effort. It can only happen when there is no resistance. And resistance comes from need, from expectation, from the belief that something must happen. But when that belief is gone, there is no resistance. And when there is no resistance, everything becomes clear. So what happens next? Everything reveals itself. Naturally. Without you needing to make it happen. And this is the point where the journey changes completely. Because you are no longer on a path toward something. You are no longer moving toward an outcome. You are simply here. Experiencing what is. And that experience is not empty. It is full. Full of awareness. Full of clarity. Full of presence. And from that place, whatever unfolds, unfolds without struggle, without confusion, without the need to understand everything. Because you already understand what matters. That your state is what determines your experience. Not the connection. Not the outcome. Not what happens next. So if you find yourself asking, what happens now? Pause. And look at where you are. Are you calm? Grounded? At peace with what is? If the answer is yes, then everything is already happening. Not in the way you expected, but in the way that is real. Because the moment you stop chasing is the moment everything can finally show itself. Not as something you create, but as something that exists. And that is what happens next. Not a new phase. Not a new pattern. But the absence of everything that was not real. And what remains is clarity. presence, and a connection that is no longer defined by movement, but by truth. Chapter 10. The final truth: the message never meant what you thought it did. There is a final realization in this journey that changes how you see everything that came before. Not just the separation, not just the silence, not just the return, but every message, every moment, every sign you thought meant something specific. Because at the end of it all, one truth becomes clear. The message never meant what you thought it did. And once you see this, everything becomes simple. For so long, the message felt important. It carried weight. It created emotion. It triggered meaning. A simple "hey" could feel like everything. A short conversation could feel like progress. A delay in response could feel like distance. Every detail mattered, because you believed the message was telling you something. About them. About the connection. About where things were going. And that belief made every moment significant. Because you were not just receiving a message. You were interpreting it. Trying to understand what it meant. Trying to connect it to a larger story. Trying to use it to define your experience. But the truth is, the message was never meant to define anything. It was never meant to give you answers. It was never meant to tell you where you stand. It was only ever a reflection of energy, a moment in time. Nothing more, nothing less. But because you attached meaning to it, it became something bigger, something that influenced how you felt, how you thought, how you experienced the connection. And that influence created movement. It pulled your attention outward. It made you react. It made you try to understand something that was never meant to be understood in that way. And that is what created the dynamic. Not the message itself, but the meaning you gave it. Because meaning creates emotion. Emotion creates reaction. Reaction creates energy. And energy shapes the connection. So every time you interpreted the message, you were not just observing it. You were influencing the dynamic. Not intentionally, but energetically. Because your state changed. And that change affected everything. But now something is different. You see the message. And it does not pull you. It does not create urgency. It does not make you question everything. It is simply there. And that simplicity changes everything. Because you are no longer attaching meaning to it. You are no longer using it to define your experience. You are no longer allowing it to shape how you feel. You are simply aware of it. And that awareness is what creates freedom. Because you are no longer dependent on what happens. You are no longer looking for answers in external moments. You are no longer trying to interpret something that is constantly changing. You are grounded, stable, at rest within yourself. And from that place, the message loses its power. Not because it is unimportant, but because it no longer controls your experience. It is just a moment, a simple interaction, something that exists, without needing to become something more. And this is the final shift. Because once you stop giving the message meaning, you stop creating the dynamic. Because the dynamic was never in the message. It was in your response, in your interpretation, in the energy you brought into it. And now, that energy is different. It is not reactive, not seeking, not trying to create something. It is present. And presence does not create patterns. It allows things to exist as they are, without distortion, without expectation, without the need to understand everything. And that is what changes everything. Because you are no longer part of the cycle. You are not reacting, not chasing, not trying to turn moments into something more. You are simply here. And in that presence, the connection becomes what it actually is. Not what you imagined, not what you feared, not what you hoped it would become, but what it truly is. And that truth is not defined by messages, not defined by timing, not defined by external events. It is defined by your state, because your state determines your experience. Not what happens, but how you experience what happens. And once your state is stable, everything else becomes simple. The message comes, and it does not change anything, because you are already where you need to be. You are not waiting, not seeking, not trying to reach a moment. You are already present, already complete. And from that place, the connection is no longer something you are trying to understand. It is something you experience, without needing it to be anything more. And this is the final truth. The message never meant what you thought it did. It was never the answer, never the solution, never the moment that would change everything. Because everything had already changed within you. And once you see that, you stop looking at external moments for meaning. You stop trying to interpret every detail. You stop waiting for something to happen. Because you realize there is nothing left to wait for. You are already there. Not at the end of a journey, but at the beginning of something real. Something that is no longer defined by patterns. No longer shaped by reaction. No longer dependent on anything outside of you. Only by your presence. And that is what changes everything. Not the message. Not the timing. Not what they do. But who you are. Because once you are no longer looking for meaning, you begin to experience truth. And truth does not need to be interpreted. It simply exists. And from that place, everything becomes clear. Not because you found the answer, but because you no longer need one. And maybe this is the moment you finally see it. Not the message. Not the timing. Not even them. But yourself. Because the truth was never hidden. It was just waiting for you to stop looking outside and start feeling within. You were never meant to decode every word. Never meant to chase every sign. Never meant to lose yourself trying to understand someone else. You were meant to become steady. To become someone who doesn't react to love, but embodies it. And when you reach that place, everything changes. Not because they came back, but because you are no longer the version of you who needed them to. So if the runner reaches out tomorrow, ask yourself this. Will you respond from who you were? Or from who you have become? Comment, "I am stable," if you feel this shift. Like this video to support deeper spiritual content. Subscribe for more insights on twin flame, energy, and conscious love.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.